The lights beneath Long Island. They say that on certain windless nights, when the Atlantic holds its breath and the pines no longer whisper, a pale light rises from the earth on Long Island, not from the horizon or the heavens, but from the ground itself. Drivers on the William Floyd Parkway have pulled over with engines idling, watching a patient glow seep up through sand and scrub like a heartbeat under skin. Some swear it hums. Others insist it is only imagination. But everyone agrees on one detail. It comes from the direction of the lab. According to official records, the story begins in 1947 when the US government converted a decommissioned army camp, Camp Upton, into a new kind of fortress, Brookhaven National Laboratory. The war had ended, but its questions had not. If the atom could be split, what else could it reveal? What could be built from the ash and light of fission? Medicine, power, or something far less forgiving? Scientists arrived with immaculate notebooks and ambitions edged in steel. Federal money followed. Concrete followed that, and below it, vaulted rooms and shielded halls were carved into the plain like a second, hidden village. The first machine to earn the lab its reputation was not loud. The Brookhaven Graphite Research Reactor, a quiet cathedral of carbon blocks and control rods, went critical in the late 1940s. It produced beams of neutrons more precise than any blade, tools sharp enough to cut into the structure of matter itself. Out of that light came isotopes for hospitals, new images of protein and crystal, and the intoxicating certainty that the atom could be persuaded to talk if you asked the right questions. But in laboratories, as in interrogation rooms, questions are never neutral. They are invitations and sometimes temptations. Decades later, more machines arrived, larger and more ambitious. The alternating gradient synchrotron began slinging particles to near the speed of light. And then, years on, the relativistic heavy ion collider would turn whole nuclei into stars for the fraction of a heartbeat, recreating conditions from the earliest moments after creation. To the public, these were milestones of discovery. To those who lived within earshot of the chain-link fences, they were also a reason to keep an eye on the night sky and on their wells, because the line between innovation and intrusion grows thin when experiments are not merely observed but endured. In the mid-1990s, an official admission surfaced like a bad dream that refuses to stay buried. Tritium from a spent spule storage pool at the high-flux beam reactor had leaked into the groundwater. The plume was mapped in cautious colors, as if a palette could soothe a community. There were briefings, hearings, acronyms stacked like sandbags. According to official statements, measured levels beyond the site boundary did not exceed limits set for public safety. But none of those sentences spoke to fear. Fear is not measured in picocuries per liter. Fear measures itself. In diner booths and on porches, recollections multiplied. The plantings that never took, the wells that tasted metallic, the persistent cough, the sudden diagnosis that left a chair empty at Sunday dinner. Anecdotes are not data, and yet they spread with the certainty of scripture. Reporters came, activists unfurled maps, lab spokespeople pointed to peer-reviewed studies and monitoring wells. The truth became a contested terrain where numbers and nightmares met at dusk and shook hands without trusting each other. And then there are the stories that never make it into the minutes of any meeting, the ones told low, with eyes turned to the parking lot. A technician who woke to metallic taste and blue afterimages. A security guard who swears the night shift is louder underground, as if the earth itself is breathing. A whisper, always prefaced with, "You didn't hear it from me," that research contracts don't always carry the same name as the real sponsor. Long Island has always been fertile ground for rumor. A few miles to the east, legends of secret antennas and mind-bending tests cling to abandoned concrete like ivy. Most of it is fantasy. Some of it is not. And the difficulty has always been telling which is which. Brookhaven's public narrative is one of medicine and materials, radioisotopes that track disease, neutron beams that divine the shapes of proteins and alloys, detectors that can hear the whisper of a particle born in a storm before stars existed. That story is true. But there's a second narrative, composed of omissions, redactions, and the peculiar absence of paper where paper should exist. The missing memo, the broken link, we couldn't locate the file at this time. In the space where facts go silent, folklore begins to sing. This series will not accuse without evidence, nor comfort with platitudes. It will move chronologically, yes, but it will also stand still in certain rooms and ask why the air felt colder there. It will collect testimony, review declassified maps, and listen for what officials do not say in a sentence as carefully as what they do. Because the history of Brookhaven is also the history of how a nation decides what the public is allowed to know when science and secrecy share a keycard. According to official records, Brookhaven National Laboratory exists to expand knowledge, but what unfolded around its fences, the illnesses, the protests, the sudden quiet resignations, does not submit neatly to any one narrative. But what happened next does not submit neatly to any one narrative. Some believe the truth has been buried forever, perhaps, or perhaps the glow that rises from the ground on windless nights is not a ghost of the past, but a sign that the past is still alive beneath our feet, patient as radiation, waiting for someone to notice. 1947 to 1950, the atomic frontier. The years immediately following the Second World War were an age of radiance and paranoia in equal measure. In 1947, as the United States tightened its grip on atomic secrets, the government transformed Camp Upton into a new type of battleground, one for the mind, the molecule, and the atom itself. Brookhaven National Laboratory was born out of the Atomic Energy Commission's desire to weaponize curiosity. The Cold War had not yet frozen, but already nations were measuring themselves by the wattage of their reactors. The early days at Brookhaven were filled with promise. Newspapers celebrated the conversion of a military installation into a beacon of peace, where science would serve humanity. Photographs from those years show men in lab coats smiling beneath signs that read, "Atoms for Peace." But even then, the line between defense and discovery blurred. In dusty rooms, behind concrete shielding, the hum of machinery was joined by another sound, the quiet, rhythmic ticking of Geiger counters pressed against walls and skin. The Brookhaven Graphite Research Reactor, BGRR, became the heart of the lab. It was a cube of precision, 700 tons of graphite, threaded with uranium fuel rods, cooled by air, and overseen by scientists who called it the most stable heart in America. Inside, neutrons were born in billions, invisible and unstoppable. They were tools, yes, but also tests, questions fired into matter with no guarantee of an answer. Some of those early questions were noble. Could radiation cure disease? Could isotopes illuminate the invisible workings of life? But others, quietly noted in the back pages of lab memos, were less benign. How much radiation could a living organism withstand before irreversible change occurred? Officially, no human testing occurred in these years. Unofficially, rumors told another story. A nurse recalled being instructed to handle vials without explanation, each labeled with coded numbers rather than names. A technician described a restricted corridor beneath the medical wing, where experiments ran through the night. None of these claims were ever proven, but their persistence speaks to a deeper truth, that secrecy itself breeds myth, and myth often grows from a seed of fact. By 1949, Brookhaven had become a hub of atomic ambition. The U.S. government poured millions into its programs, transforming the facility into a sprawling city of scientists. Buses brought in researchers from universities across the East Coast. The air smelled faintly metallic, a blend of ozone, graphite, and damp concrete. The locals joked that Long Island sunsets had grown brighter since the lab opened. Few laughed without unease. Public tours were sometimes allowed, carefully choreographed to display safety and transparency. Visitors were shown gleaming corridors, modern cafeterias, and control rooms where white-coated scientists spoke in calm, technical tones. No one mentioned the lower levels, the service tunnels, the sealed doors marked authorized personnel only. In those depths, engineers worked under humming lamps, repairing equipment that seemed to hum back. One worker described hearing what he called voices in the static, as if the machines were whispering their own version of the truth. Then came the first anomaly. In early 1950, monitors detected unexpected spikes in background radiation near one of the coolant vents. No leak was confirmed, and reports describe it as an instrumental fluctuation. Yet weeks later, a janitor reported nausea and burns on his arms. He was quietly transferred to a hospital upstate and never returned to work. No official connection was ever acknowledged. But for those who remained, a quiet dread began to seep into the concrete, the realization that beneath the equations and optimism, they were participating in something neither entirely safe nor entirely understood. As Brookhaven's lights glowed brighter, so too did its shadows. Scientists began to realize that the more deeply they stared into the atom, the more it seemed to stare back. And in that reflection, somewhere between brilliance and blindness, lay the beginning of secrets that would haunt the lab for decades to come. The reactor and the residents. By 1949, Brookhaven National Laboratory had become a beacon of post-war scientific optimism. Its towering reactor dome, gleaming against the flat expanse of Long Island's Pine Barrens, symbolized progress and power, the dawn of a new atomic age. Locals called it the Bright House, but the brightness, they would later say, never felt like daylight. At first, the laboratory's relationship with the nearby towns was cordial. Scientists shopped at the same stores, their children attended the same schools. The lab brought jobs, paved roads, and electricity to rural hamlets like Ridge and Shirley. Every Friday, buses delivered workers past security gates where signs read in bold letters, "For a safer tomorrow." No one questioned what that meant. Then, in the summer of 1950, strange things began to happen. Residents reported an acrid metallic odor drifting through the air at night. Dogs refused to go outdoors. At dawn, a faint shimmer hung above the trees, like heat haze on a cool morning. The laboratory issued a statement attributing it to routine exhaust from reactor cooling systems. Yet local fishermen swore the ponds near the property lines glowed faintly under moonlight. When one man tried to show authorities a jar of the water, it was confiscated. He later received a polite letter thanking him for his vigilance. Inside the facility, engineers faced their own mysteries. Pressure gauges fluctuated without cause, Geiger counters clicked irregularly, and newly installed shielding panels produced a persistent hum that no one could trace. A young physicist, Dr. Martin Greeley, proposed that residual particles from reactor tests were interacting with the soil's magnetic composition. His report was marked unverified anomaly and quietly removed from circulation. Weeks later, he was reassigned to a theoretical division in New Mexico. Among the laboratory staff, talk of the hum spread like rumor. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, subtle, rhythmic, impossible to localize. Workers claimed they could feel it, even after leaving the grounds. In their homes, in their sleep, medical officers diagnosed occupational fatigue. One nurse noted that several patients complained of dreaming impulses, each dream ending with a sudden flash of light and the sensation of falling through water. By autumn, nearby hospitals began logging unusual symptoms among residents: nausea, tremors, sleeplessness, skin irritation without visible cause. Local physicians suggested stress from the post-war boom. Others whispered that something was leaking from the lab. At a town meeting in Mastic Beach, a mother stood up and asked why her son's hair had turned white overnight. A laboratory representative assured her there was no measurable hazard. The audience applauded, but she wept all the same. Then, a few months later, during a night shift, a security patrol observed a pale mist seeping from a ventilation shaft near the reactor dome. It clung to the ground like smoke, glowing faintly blue before dispersing into the trees. The report filed that night ended with a single line: personnel instructed not to discuss atmospheric anomalies. The next day, the shaft was welded shut. Within a week, the security officer who filed the report transferred to another site and vanished from payroll records entirely. Meanwhile, the hum grew stronger. Sensitive equipment on the second floor of the reactor wing began registering oscillations synchronized to a precise rhythm, 71 seconds apart. The pattern was consistent, unaffected by shutdowns or maintenance cycles. Residual magnetic feedback, the technicians concluded. But when they disconnected the power source entirely, the readings persisted. The phenomenon was soon forgotten amid the rush of new experiments. Funding increased, and the laboratory expanded its mandate. Yet in the nearby towns, unease lingered. Children drew pictures of the glowing woods, and old-timers swore the air around the lab felt charged, like a storm that never ends. The local newspaper ran an editorial entitled, "Progress or Peril." It was removed from archives the next day. Years later, one surviving technician would describe that period with a simple phrase: "We thought we were building light, but something was already watching from inside it." The breach of containment. In February 1951, a technician named Leonard Ash entered the reactor control chamber at 2:14 a.m. for routine maintenance. According to the incident report filed later that morning, he was found unconscious beside the central console, his radiation badge untriggered, his body cold but without burns. When revived, Ash insisted he hadn't fainted. He claimed the lights had dimmed, the hum had grown louder, and the control panel had breathed. The attending physician wrote psychological shock in the file margin. Ash was sent on indefinite leave. He never returned. Officially, the event was classified as a power fluctuation caused by faulty wiring. Unofficially, it marked the beginning of Brookhaven's darkest period. The facility experienced a sequence of anomalies: temperature spikes in sealed corridors, unexplained loss of pressure in storage chambers, and synchronized equipment failures across unrelated systems. Engineers joked that the building had developed a heartbeat. On March 7th, the reactor dome registered an unaccountable surge in electromagnetic activity. The readings formed a pattern: 3 short peaks, a pause, then a long one. The same rhythm appeared in seismographs across the lab's perimeter. It repeated every 71 seconds. Attempts to isolate the origin failed. Each time sensors were recalibrated, the pattern shifted. Instruments placed outside the facility began recording it faintly through the ground. Within days, nearby farms reported livestock refusing to enter certain fields. A few residents mentioned the shaking, though no tremors were recorded. Internal memos labeled the event Containment Fluctuation Alpha. Weeks later, a janitor discovered a small puddle of condensation forming beneath a locked sublevel door. The liquid was clear, but oddly viscous, and its temperature measured several degrees below ambient. Samples were taken and sent to an external lab for testing. The results, if they existed, never returned. The door was welded shut within 48 hours. By summer, staff rotations increased. Entire divisions were reassigned overnight without explanation. Researchers began signing non-disclosure addendums under threat of prosecution. The cafeteria emptied earlier each evening. The hum, once background noise, had become inescapable. Low, rhythmic, pulsing through concrete and steel alike. Visitors described it as like standing inside a living engine. In September, a small team led by Dr. Helen Crane initiated an internal investigation. They discovered that radiation detectors nearest the reactor showed negative readings, values below measurable baseline, as though something were absorbing energy rather than emitting it. Their findings were flagged for review, and the team was quietly disbanded. Crane's clearance was revoked. She left a single note in her desk drawer: "It's not leaking out, it's pulling in." And 2 weeks later, a full shutdown drill was ordered. The reactor went dark, but the hum continued. Microphones placed near the sublevel walls recorded a faint rhythmic vibration. When analyzed at high speed, It resembled a distorted human voice pattern, intonations, pauses, even breath intervals. The audio engineer who processed the file quit the next day. Brookhaven officially logged the incident as an internal equipment malfunction during test cycle maintenance. But for those who were there, it was the night the lab stopped feeling like a laboratory and started feeling like a mouth that had begun to whisper back. The disappearing records. By late 1951, Brookhaven's halls echoed less with discovery and more with silence. Entire sections of the lab's archives, files, recordings, handwritten notes, began vanishing. The first to notice was the records clerk, an aging archivist named Marion Halpern. She reported that catalog numbers no longer matched existing entries, that photographs she personally developed weeks earlier now showed empty hallways where people had stood. Her complaint reached administration. Within days, her position was dissolved. Her personnel file would later list her as transferred to clerical support, facility unknown. In a secure sublevel, technicians discovered that reels of magnetic tape from the reactor's diagnostic sensors had degraded overnight. Not erased, reversed. The playback ran backward, producing not static but rhythmic pulses, evenly spaced every 71 seconds. When reversed again, the pattern remained identical, suggesting that the data had been restructured rather than corrupted. Attempts to back up the remaining records triggered system failures. The network administrator, Charles Reeve, documented at least 12 incidents in which storage drives refused to accept new data after being connected to reactor monitors. He called it a feedback loop that writes itself. His final memo ended with the words, "If these files are being deleted, then something is deciding what doesn't belong here." 2 weeks later, Reeves' home caught fire. Investigators ruled it an electrical accident. Meanwhile, laboratory correspondence began to fracture. Routine memos arrived in duplicate, with slight variations in wording. One version would list a meeting's location as Building 4C, the other, Building 6A. The timestamps matched. No one admitted to sending either copy. When the duplication reached formal government channels, the issue was dismissed as administrative error caused by overlapping data entry. The files were purged. In December, security staff reported unauthorized access to the storage vaults. Surveillance cameras showed no breach, but on review, each film reel ended with a single frame of total white light, then resumed seconds later, the intruders unseen. The effect was identical across multiple camera angles. The equipment manufacturer confirmed no technical fault. By early 1952, Brookhaven's information control shifted from scientific oversight to national security classification. Visitors were screened, deliveries inspected, correspondence monitored. The atmosphere turned from research to containment. The cafeteria conversations faded into whispers. Some said the hum had changed. It now seemed to echo from the archive wing itself, pulsing faintly through the metal cabinets. Others swore the sound stopped entirely whenever anyone mentioned missing documents. The surviving fragments from this period paint a picture of deliberate erasure. Lab journals show pages torn precisely at intervals, as if selected by mathematical pattern. Typewritten reports end mid-sentence, punctuation cut cleanly in half. Photographs stored in sealed envelopes display faint impressions of handwriting pressed into their surfaces. Words that don't match any known file. One reads simply, "We kept the wrong things." In March 1952, the Department of Energy issued an internal directive. Cease all independent documentation practices. Centralize record-keeping at headquarters. Overnight, decades of scientific autonomy vanished. The laboratory's motto, "For a safer tomorrow," was quietly removed from its main gate. In its place, a new sign appeared. Authorized personnel only. When questioned years later, a retired staffer summarized the transition succinctly. "It wasn't that we lost the data, it's that something else started keeping it for us." The silence protocol. By 1956, the glow that once symbolized progress had dimmed into something colder. Officially, Brookhaven was thriving. The alternating gradient synchrotron was nearing completion. Federal grants were flowing. and scientific journals praised the laboratory's breakthroughs in nuclear medicine. Yet inside the fences, an invisible lockdown had begun. It was not declared, only enforced, a protocol that the staff came to call, with bitter humor, the silence. It began quietly. Memoranda disappeared from filing cabinets. Outgoing mail was rerouted through Washington. Security badges were replaced without notice, and some names were never reissued. Visitors were restricted. Journalists denied entry, and even senior researchers were told that certain experiments had been temporarily suspended for review. No one ever clarified what was being reviewed, but everyone understood. Something had gone wrong, and now the walls themselves seemed to listen. In the local press, odd stories began to surface. Reports of unmarked trucks arriving at night, of convoys heading toward the Pine Barrens. A reporter from Newsday who tried to photograph one such convoy had his film confiscated by men claiming to be from the Atomic Energy Commission. The next week, Newsday printed a brief correction. The vehicles were routine deliveries of construction materials. No one mentioned that the driver had refused to give his name. Inside the lab, the changes were more precise. Engineers from the reactor division were transferred to Project G Room, an internal classification whose purpose was never explained. Entry required double clearance, and those assigned to it were forbidden to speak about their work, even to colleagues. Some later confided that they were testing radiation shielding far thicker than anything used above ground. But for what purpose, none could say. One technician described strange containers, sealed in lead and labeled only with the word biologic. Officially, Brookhaven denied conducting any biological or human research, yet hospital records from nearby Shirley and Mastic began to show a rise in unexplained illnesses, persistent nausea, dizziness, nervous tremors. Doctors called it local anxiety syndrome. Locals called it the Brookhaven sickness. When a small group of residents petitioned for an independent inspection, the request was buried under procedural reviews. The phrase "no immediate hazard" appeared again and again in the correspondence, like a spell meant to contain fear. Then, in March 1957, a memo circulated among upper management under the heading Silence Protocol, Level 3. It outlined new procedures for information containment, mandating that all communications, both scientific and personal, pass through a single point of approval. Typewriters were removed from certain offices, telephones were rewired. Even casual conversations in the cafeteria could result in reassignment. The message was clear. From now on, knowledge itself was contraband. Some resisted. Dr. Helen Brower, a physicist in isotope development, was known for challenging authority. After questioning why certain reactor readings had been erased from the monthly logs, she was placed on extended leave. 2 months later, her name vanished from the staff directory. The lab issued a statement claiming she had transferred to a private contractor in Nevada. No contractor by that name was ever found. Meanwhile, federal auditors arrived under the pretext of reviewing budgets. Their questions rarely concerned finances. They examined notebooks, photographs, even personal correspondence. One junior researcher recalled that an entire filing cabinet was wheeled out of his office and replaced with an empty one. When he asked what had happened to the data, the response was simple: reclassified. Outside, protesters gathered along the main gate carrying hand-painted signs. "We deserve the truth." Guards in unmarked uniforms stood watch but never engaged. Reporters noted that the air above the reactor site shimmered faintly, like heat distortion, though the day was cold. The lab's public relations office blamed optical refraction from ventilation exhaust. The explanation satisfied no one. By the end of the decade, the silence protocol had become a way of life. Researchers stopped asking questions they knew could not be answered. Locals learned to look away when the sky pulsed faintly after midnight. The laboratory functioned flawlessly, its reports immaculate, its staff obedient. Yet under the polished surface, paranoia took root like mold in the concrete, unseen but spreading. What was once a center of enlightenment had become a fortress of omission. The pursuit of knowledge had given way to the management of secrecy. Files were stamped "destroy" after review. Voices were measured, and every truth was weighed against its potential damage to the institution. And through it all, the reactor kept humming, steady, patient, indifferent, as if the building itself had absorbed the habit of silence. Echoes of the reactor. By the early 1960s, Brookhaven had become a fortress of silence, its fences higher, its records tighter, its personnel leaner. But silence does not erase echoes. Beneath the hum of the reactor, something else persisted, faint, rhythmic pulses detected by the monitoring instruments long after the generator shut down. At first, technicians dismissed them as residual feedback. Then they realized the pattern repeated every 71 seconds, precise as a heartbeat. In the reactor control room, engineers began to notice fluctuations in magnetic fields. Compasses twitched on their own. Gauges that had remained stable for years now drifted inexplicably. The readings were logged, reviewed, and promptly classified. The term electronic anomaly appeared in several reports, always followed by the same directive: do not pursue. But not everyone obeyed. A young physicist, Dr. Robert Gaines, began keeping his own secret notes. He had noticed that the pulse frequency corresponded with seismic data from beneath the facility. Tremors so faint they registered nowhere else on Long Island. He proposed that the reactor's experimental core, when overloaded during an unrecorded test in 1958, had created a standing electromagnetic field deep underground. His memo reached the security office. The next morning, Gaines's badge access was revoked. His apartment was cleared within the week. Workers began to talk, quietly, in parking lots or while smoking behind the coolant towers. They said they heard things in the concrete, like a whisper behind the walls. One janitor described it as a buzzing voice just below hearing, like the building is thinking. Another claimed the lights flickered in patterns that formed words if you stared long enough. None of these stories reached the press. They died inside the perimeter, like everything else that didn't fit the official record. In 1962, a brief electrical outage triggered an automatic reactor shutdown. The backup systems engaged instantly, too instantly. According to a declassified maintenance log from years later, power was restored before any human operator touched the controls. No mechanical fault was found. When questioned, the shift supervisor merely said, "The system corrected itself." He was reassigned to a desk position the following month. Outside the lab, the community continued to grow restless. Cattle near the southern boundary were found with unusual lesions. Children reported hearing a low humming in the fields at night. A local teacher, curious, brought a Geiger counter to class as a demonstration. It spiked near the windows. The next week, the school received a federal equipment safety inspection. The Geiger counter was confiscated. Then came the recordings. Late one evening, two radio hobbyists from Suffolk County intercepted a series of encrypted frequencies near 17 megahertz, well within the range used by government facilities. The signal pulsed steadily, then shifted into a rising oscillation. When slowed down, it produced a sound resembling human speech. The phrase, some claimed, repeated the words "don't open it" again and again. The men reported their discovery to a local station. Within 48 hours, both were visited by officials identifying themselves as representatives of public safety. Their recordings were seized. Inside Brookhaven, maintenance crews found condensation dripping from pipes that carried no water. Instruments detected static where no power flowed. A guard described hearing footsteps in corridors long since sealed off for renovation. Another said he followed the sound of typing into an abandoned office, only to find the typewriter moving on its own, key by key, striking the same word repeatedly: remember. Administrators dismissed it all as stress, the product of overwork and isolation. Yet they ordered additional containment measures: more lead lining, thicker walls, restricted access to sublevel C. The deeper the secrecy, the stronger the phenomena seemed to grow. Scientists whispered that the reactor had birthed something not alive, but aware, a kind of echo trapped within its own field, feeding on every attempt to suppress it. By 1964, the lab began installing vibration dampeners across the site. The pulses continued. Telemetry equipment recorded faint electromagnetic surges every night between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., always originating from the same coordinates, the sealed reactor chamber. Security logs show that 2 guards resigned on the same night, leaving notes that read only, "It's still awake." Officially, Brookhaven reported routine maintenance upgrades. Privately, several staff were relocated to a new classified facility out west, a place that, according to declassified memos decades later, would be known as the Nevada Research Annex. Whatever followed them there, it was never mentioned again. But in the homes surrounding the lab, the faint hum still returned each winter, soft, rhythmic, almost human, as if the reactor beneath the ground was breathing, waiting for someone to listen. The whispers beneath. By 1965, the hum of the Brookhaven reactor had changed. It was no longer the steady industrial vibration of machinery, but something layered, uneven, almost alive. The technicians working the night shifts reported a low resonance that seemed to respond to movement, like an echo waiting to be provoked. They called it the second sound. No one could prove its existence on instruments, yet everyone who stayed past midnight swore they heard it. The lab administration dismissed the claims as fatigue, but those same weeks, the magnetic interference levels on the main power grid began to spike irregularly, disrupting nearby radio and television broadcasts. Residents in Ridge and Yaphank complained that their sets would suddenly buzz and flicker, showing flashes of white light that formed half-seen silhouettes before cutting to static. Engineers from the Public Utility Commission visited the area. They left without comment and never returned. Within the laboratory, a small internal team was formed to study the phenomenon under the codename Echo Recovery. The official purpose was to investigate low-frequency interference from the reactor's older circuits. But in private correspondence, letters later declassified, the scientists referred to it as the resonance field. According to their notes, this frequency did not merely pass through materials, it interacted with them, as though matter itself was resonating back. Dr. Raymond Holt, an acoustic specialist, proposed that the vibrations were a byproduct of subatomic interactions occurring below the reactor's containment layer. "Something is speaking through the frequency," he wrote, "though it may not be speaking to us." His team set up a makeshift recording chamber near the sublevel corridors. They left reel-to-reel tapes running overnight, documenting every audible disturbance. The first nights were uneventful, just machinery hum, dripping condensation, the occasional hiss of steam. But on the 5th night, something changed. When the tapes were played back in the morning, there was a pause between the electrical bursts, a space of silence followed by a faint voice. The words were unintelligible, like whispers underwater, yet distinctly rhythmic. Holt replayed the segment dozens of times, convinced it wasn't a mechanical error. His colleagues disagreed, but none could explain why the voice deepened each time they copied the recording. Rumors spread quietly through the lab. Guards on the lower levels refused to patrol alone. One maintenance worker claimed he saw frost forming on the concrete walls, even though the temperature was above 70 degrees. Another swore that the air itself vibrated near sublevel C, distorting his reflection in the metal doors. The anomalies were written off as stress symptoms. Yet, a week later, the worker who reported them was found unconscious near the same hallway, his hair streaked gray. When Holt submitted his report to the directors, it was stamped restricted and filed under Project Echo Recovery. He was told to discontinue further experiments until authorization from Washington. 2 weeks later, he vanished during his morning commute. His car was found abandoned on the Long Island Expressway with the engine running. The recording tapes from his lab were gone. Following his disappearance, Brookhaven's Public Affairs Office issued a statement attributing the ongoing disturbances to vibration anomalies caused by experimental cooling systems. But declassified memos decades later revealed that engineers had dismantled the entire sublevel recording setup only hours after Holt vanished. Security logs confirm that several unidentified crates were loaded onto government trucks that same night and driven toward the Air Force Base at Calverton. In the months that followed, the phenomena spread. Equipment in unrelated departments began to malfunction. Typewriters jammed when left overnight. Oscilloscopes displayed repeating words instead of waveforms. Fragments like "below, awake, we wait." Electrical circuits failed only during the hours of 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock a.m., mirroring the timeline of the reactor's unexplained pulses from years earlier. Even the backup generators emitted that same eerie hum. An internal memo dated October 1965 outlined the final directive for echo recovery. Cease all acoustic data acquisition. Containment integrity must take priority. There will be no further monitoring of sublevel phenomena. The order was signed by 3 officials, none of whom could later be verified as Brookhaven employees. By winter, the strange sounds had stopped, at least officially. Workers returning after holidays claimed the air still vibrated faintly, like an afterimage of noise trapped between the walls. Local residents said their televisions continued to flicker, forming faces that vanished when approached. And somewhere beneath the laboratory, deep within the old containment chambers, something continued to hum, not mechanical, not human, but deliberate, as if waiting for someone to listen again. Containment breach. By 1966, Brookhaven's silence had become unbearable. What once sounded like the hum of machinery now carried a faint irregularity, a syncopation that no engineer could explain. Some called it an echo delay. Others said it was the building breathing. But when the sound began to rise in pitch, like metal under pressure, containment was declared compromised. Officially, the reactor entered a maintenance shutdown. Unofficially, the laboratory sublevel C was sealed without warning. Dozens of staff were reassigned to unrelated projects across the country. Others were told to stay home until further notice. No public statement was made. Yet, within days, residents miles away reported lights flickering and pets refusing to approach the direction of the facility. Inside, emergency logs describe a sequence of system failures that never reached the press. Pressure gauges fluctuated without source, ventilation ducts emitted strange static, and air temperature shifted between extremes within minutes. Then came the most unsettling entry. Auditory phenomenon persists without power supply. The phrase appeared repeatedly in handwritten annotations, as though the machines themselves refused to stop humming. Containment protocols were rewritten on the spot. A new directive, labeled Alpha Lockdown, ordered that all communication lines be severed and all data transferred to secure federal storage. The message concluded with a chilling addendum: do not attempt to power down the reactor manually. It is unclear whether this order came from Washington or from within Brookhaven itself. Witnesses from the night shift later described the corridors as pulsing with faint light, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat traveling through concrete. A security guard recalled that the pattern matched the 71-second rhythm detected years earlier. He tried to report it to command, but was told that containment was stable. 2 hours later, the sublevel motion sensors recorded movement in sealed chambers where no personnel were listed. The breach was never officially acknowledged. Local newspapers ran a brief headline: "Minor electrical incident at research facility, no danger to public." But leaked maintenance reports tell another story. Several technicians assigned to cleanup described black residue coating the containment walls, a soot that emitted a low-frequency vibration when touched. Samples were taken for analysis, though the results were never released. In the weeks that followed, the government dispatched a covert response team under the codename Project Tether. Their goal: stabilize the reactor core and retrieve all remaining data. They entered on February 4th, Only partial logs exist of what they found. The surviving entries mention equipment unresponsive, auditory distortion increasing, and finally, no visual contact with primary chamber. After that, the documentation ends mid-sentence. When the lab reopened 6 months later, Sublevel C was permanently closed off. The area was declared non-essential. Staff were instructed to avoid mentioning Project Tether. Visitors were told that the renovation was due to infrastructure corrosion, and yet electrical usage records show an unexplained surge beneath the sealed section every night between 2 and 3 a.m., the same window when the hum had once been heard. Years later, a declassified aerial image from 1968 revealed something strange: a faint circular pattern of scorched vegetation surrounding the site, perfectly symmetrical, as if the ground itself had resonated. Local residents said it glowed faintly on moonless nights. Officials blamed fertilizer runoff. Whatever happened during those 6 months, it was erased with surgical precision. Personnel files were destroyed, and entire storage rooms of equipment vanished without inventory. Only one memo survived in an unrelated archive: "Containment achieved. Do not reopen the field. It listens now." Project Tether. In February 1966, 1 week after the reported containment breach, a classified task force arrived at Brookhaven under the name Project Tether. The name appeared benign in paperwork, field stabilization research, but witnesses described something closer to a military occupation. Trucks with blank license plates rolled in under heavy fog, carrying equipment not registered to any known agency. The entire site was placed under federal jurisdiction. Even senior researchers were denied entry to the sublevels. Only a handful of personnel, most wearing radiation suits marked with an unfamiliar crest, a circle split by a line, were granted clearance. The mission logs, later redacted and partially reconstructed, show that the team's goal was not to deactivate the reactor, but to anchor it. The breach, they wrote, had created a persistent electromagnetic torsion field below the containment chamber. Instruments detected movement in the readings, not of heat or energy, but of structure. "The field is forming geometry," one scientist noted in a classified memo, "as though it were learning its own boundaries." On February 9th, sensors detected rhythmic distortions that matched the old 71-second pulse, the same heartbeat first recorded years earlier. But now the amplitude was increasing exponentially. Project Tether deployed high-capacity grounding arrays into the sublevel corridors, feeding them directly into the power grid. For 48 hours, readings stabilized. Then, without warning, all systems began outputting identical patterns, a precise numerical sequence that repeated every 11 minutes. Engineers tried to trace the source, but found no physical signal. The data was emerging simultaneously from every recording device. Audio specialists describe hearing a faint harmonic tone buried inside the interference. When filtered, it formed a repeating waveform similar to human speech. A linguistics consultant was flown in from Washington to analyze it. His notes describe the sound as too structured to be random, but too alien to be language. He was last seen entering the containment corridor on February 13th. His name was redacted from all subsequent records. By February 15th, the operation reached critical phase. The Tether team deployed what they called phase bindings, large metallic rings embedded into the reactor's foundation, designed to redirect the energy inward. At 2:13 a.m., a massive surge struck the containment core. Lights across the facility dimmed. One technician, writing in the margins of a logbook, scrawled, "The sound is inside my head now. It's not the hum, it's whispering." Shortly afterward, communications were lost. The following entries are fragmented, one line per page, scattered across what remained of the Project Tether archive. Among them, "Do not touch the walls." 2. It knows the sequence. "We open something we cannot measure." Seal C3. It's not metal anymore. Pause. At 3:47 a.m., an unmarked aircraft departed from Brookhaven's private airstrip, carrying 3 sealed containers and 6 surviving members of the task force. A separate internal memo issued 2 days later, written on AEC letterhead but unsigned, ordered the immediate sterilization of the facility. All personnel involved in Project Tether were reassigned to undisclosed locations. The lab reopened under a new civilian directorate 6 months later, its reactor rebranded as a medical isotope facility. Decades later, when Brookhaven's archives were partially declassified, researchers uncovered faint thermal imprints still embedded in the concrete around the sublevel perimeter, concentric circles radiating outward like ripples frozen in stone. Even after reconstruction, no one could explain the residual energy signatures that continued to emit at 71-second intervals. One anonymous whistleblower, a former engineer, later claimed in an interview that the term tether had not referred to containment at all, but to communication. He said the project's true objective was not to seal the field, but to keep it connected, to listen to whatever was speaking through the static. And that, he added quietly, it still answers if you know the right frequency. The frequency that answers. By the early 1970s, Brookhaven's reactor had been reborn under a new name, the High Flux Beam Facility. Officially, it was a symbol of renewal, a monument to scientific progress after a decade of secrecy. But for those who had been there during Project Tether, the hum beneath the floors never faded. It was quieter now, disciplined, as though waiting for permission to speak again. A new generation of researchers arrived, fresh graduates from MIT and Caltech, unaware of the events buried in classified archives. They came to study neutron beams, radiation scattering, the frontier of atomic precision. Yet within months, strange anomalies began to reappear. Instruments recording signals with no input, typewritten pages filling with characters when left unattended, and frequencies detected far below the measurable range of sound. It started with a single reading. On March 4, 1971, technician Alan Morrow logged an acoustic residual at 0.14 Hz, a frequency too low for human hearing. He dismissed it as seismic noise until the waveform repeated exactly every 71 seconds. He checked the archives for coincidence, only to find that old entries from 1956 had been replaced. Not blacked out, rewritten. The ink was newer, the wording colder. Every mention of hum had become oscillation. Every date aligned perfectly with the pattern now returning. When Morrow showed his findings to the lab supervisor, he was told to file it as electromagnetic drift and not discuss it further. Instead, he began recording the signal himself, using a handheld tape machine hidden beneath his desk. On the third night, the hum changed. The waveform curved upward, forming modulation spikes resembling human phonetics. The playback, slowed to human tempo, revealed 3 words, "Do you hear?" Morrow thought it was a prank. He played it for his colleagues in reactor control. One laughed nervously and unplugged the recorder. But later that night, the same phrase appeared on a printer in the control room, printed in block text across 6 pages. Each page carried the same line, "Do you hear?" No operator had initiated a print job. The event triggered a minor panic. Management disconnected all peripheral systems and ran diagnostics. Nothing was found. But the phenomenon spread. Monitors flickered. Calibration dials drifted in perfect rhythm with the 71-second cycle, and low-frequency interference bled into the building's communication lines. Phone receivers emitted faint breathing sounds when lifted. A physicist swore he heard his own voice answering back, delayed by 7 seconds. Within weeks, federal observers arrived. They claimed to be from the Department of Energy, though their badges carried no department names. They reviewed logs, seized tapes, and instructed the staff to suspend all non-essential research. Yet one technician overheard a conversation between the observers. They were debating whether the signal was still autonomous or if someone had reactivated it. In the following days, entire datasets began to alter themselves. Measurements taken in 1964 reappeared with corrected decimals. Old signatures on official reports were replaced by names of people who had never worked at Brookhaven. It was as though the history of the facility was rewriting itself to match the new signal. The changes were subtle, almost polite, until the message grew bolder. On April 2, 1971, every radio in the facility emitted the same tone, a sustained, hollow frequency that lingered for 1 minute and 11 seconds. When transcribed as spectrograms, the shapes formed the outline of a circle split by a line, the same insignia found on the Project Tether suits years before. The younger staff thought it was coincidence. The older ones stopped coming to work. One by one, the anomalies intensified. Film footage from experiments developed with inverted frames. X-ray photographs revealed shadows that didn't correspond to any known object. The hum was no longer confined to the reactor. It now resonated through the ventilation system, traveling the length of the facility like a pulse. Every 71 seconds, it seemed to wait. A pause, an invitation. When Morrow presented his final report, it ended with a single sentence, written in the margins, barely legible. It's answering back. The next morning, his workstation was cleared, his access revoked. The logbook where he kept his recordings was returned weeks later, blank. But late at night, in the empty corridors of the high-flux facility, security guards swore they still heard it. A faint tone behind the hum, steady and patient, repeating itself endlessly, as though calling for a reply. The reopened files. In 1973, nearly 2 years after the last unexplained transmission, Brookhaven's Internal Security Division received a directive from Washington. Conduct a full audit of all classified archives. The order came without explanation. The team responsible was told only that discrepancies had been detected in the metadata of Project Tether's records, dates that no longer matched official logs, files appearing under names of personnel who never existed. What began as a bureaucratic review would become something far stranger. The archives were housed beneath the reactor wing, in a concrete vault sealed since the late 1960s. When the audit team pried it open, the air was heavy, stale, and metallic. Rows of filing cabinets lined the chamber. The drawers opened easily, but most of the paper had yellowed to the point of disintegration. The first anomaly appeared in Box 47B, a reel-to-reel tape labeled Tether Primary Link 021466. No such record was listed in the surviving inventory. When played on a portable machine, the tape emitted a faint static pulse every 71 seconds. The sound seemed harmless until the third playback, when the frequency shifted and the room's fluorescent lights dimmed in unison. The audit supervisor ordered the tape sealed in a lead-lined container. 2 hours later, the recording vanished from the evidence log. The guards on duty could not recall anyone entering the vault. Within days, other irregularities surfaced. Microfilm rolls cataloged under unrelated projects now contained images of reactor schematics dated years before the actual construction began. Handwritten annotations appeared in the margins of documents that had been untouched for decades. Phrases such as, "We heard it again," "Don't answer," and "It still knows the code." Forensic analysis confirmed that the ink was less than a year old. The Department of Energy dispatched a secondary review unit to verify the findings. Their report, later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, noted that the physical documents themselves appeared to change between inspections. A memo that once read, "Subject terminated," would, days later, read, "Subject transferred." Photocopies made for verification turned out blank, while originals continued to degrade at an accelerated rate. One inspector wrote, "We are watching the records rewrite themselves." In late 1973, a data technician discovered a locked cabinet labeled Archive 9C. Its key was missing, but the door had already been forced open from the inside. Inside were folders marked with the same circle and line emblem that had appeared throughout the Tether logs. Among them, a single photograph stood out, a grainy black and white image of the containment chamber. The walls glowed faintly in the frame. Etched into the concrete, barely visible, was a sentence: "Listen back." After that discovery, the audit was abruptly halted. All surviving documents were loaded into unmarked containers and transferred to an unknown destination. The official explanation cited possible contamination of materials, but the internal communication logs tell another story. The lead archivist noted a repeating noise on the tape recorders used during the audit, an intermittent low hum that pulsed at exactly 71-second intervals. When cross-referenced against the old reactor logs, the frequency matched perfectly. The reopened files were sealed again within weeks, this time under a new classification, Cipher Echo. No further records of the audit exist. Yet employees who worked near the archives claimed that for months afterward, the building's ventilation ducts carried a soft, rhythmic vibration, as if the very documents they had uncovered were whispering to be read once more. Cipher Echo. In early 1974, a directive marked Cipher Echo was issued to a small, off-record division of the Department of Energy. Its stated purpose: analysis of anomalous acoustic and electromagnetic events associated with historical research sites. Unofficially, it was a resurrection of Project Tether, but this time, the objective was not containment, it was communication. The project operated out of a windowless facility in Virginia, known only as Building 24B. Few records of its existence survive, though a later testimony from a contractor describes a chamber lined with blackened copper panels and rows of analog oscillographs. In the center of the room, a modified signal array continuously broadcasted on low-band frequencies, the same range once detected beneath Brookhaven's reactor. Engineers called it the mirror line, believing that whatever had spoken before might speak again if given the proper resonance. At first, the results were nothing but static. Then, after 12 consecutive days of uninterrupted transmission, the pattern returned, faint, rhythmic, and unmistakably deliberate. The analysts nicknamed it the pulse. When decoded into visual format, the waveform formed irregular peaks that, when slowed, revealed repeating geometries, circles divided by a line, over and over. Drawn as if by unseen hands, it was the same symbol that had haunted the margins of Brookhaven's logs for decades. Dr. Stephen Marlowe, a linguist from the National Cryptologic Center, was brought in to lead the interpretive effort. He theorized that the signal contained a syntax, a kind of nonverbal grammar structured through harmonic ratios. By transposing the audio into spectrographic form, he isolated fragments that recurred with mathematical precision. One sequence repeated precisely every 71 seconds. Another appeared to respond when the transmission array shifted its amplitude. It was, in effect, a dialogue, primitive but self-correcting. Marlowe proposed that the entity behind the signal, whether natural or artificial, was adaptive. When frequencies were modulated upward, the response adjusted downward, maintaining equilibrium. It listens, he wrote in a report later censored, and it learns. His team began assigning symbolic meaning to tonal patterns, short pulses for affirmation, sustained vibrations for negation. After weeks of testing, the array produced what appeared to be the first direct reply. 3 low bursts followed by a long one. Translated under Marlowe's model, it read simply as yes. Following the breakthrough, Cipher Echo expanded rapidly. Funding tripled, staff doubled. And a secondary broadcast facility was built within Brookhaven itself, underground, near the decommissioned containment chamber. Engineers reported that each time they transmitted, faint tremors rippled through the surrounding soil, as though something beneath were stirring in recognition. Several personnel began experiencing auditory hallucinations, faint voices repeating their own words, slightly distorted, as if played back from an unseen recorder. Medical evaluations found no cause. Then, in June 1974, Cipher Echo recorded a pattern that differed from all previous transmissions. The sequence lasted 11 minutes, continuous and layered. When visualized, it formed not geometry, but text, strings of binary digits separated into 8-character segments. When converted through ASCII translation, it produced a single phrase: "Do not speak." The event triggered an immediate lockdown. The transmission logs were sealed, the data storage reels destroyed, and Marlowe's team reassigned. Yet a week later, another message arrived unprovoked, identical in format but shorter. "We hear." The reply came with no outgoing signal, as if the source had learned to transmit on its own. Cipher Echo was officially terminated in September 1974. The final report, declassified in fragments years later, ended with a single handwritten line on the last page: "The conversation continues." Rumors persist among former technicians that one terminal remained active, a small analog receiver still tuned to the original frequency. They say it still clicks faintly every 71 seconds, waiting, patient, as though the field beneath Brookhaven is still listening for its next question. The final transmission by 1978. Cipher Echo existed only in rumor and redacted memos. The project's dissolution had left behind a handful of damaged tapes, a few burned reels, and a silence that felt manufactured. The Department of Energy denied the project's existence, but its engineers could not forget the rhythm that haunted their sleep, the pulse every 71 seconds, the static that seemed to whisper back. For most, it was buried and forgotten, until the signal returned. In November of that year, a private radio enthusiast from Pennsylvania, Harold Nance, began documenting a strange interference on his shortwave receiver. It came at precise intervals, 71 seconds apart, and consisted of 3 pulses followed by a sustained tone. At first, he thought it was military traffic. Then, one night, he slowed the playback and swore he heard a word inside the hum again. His logs, later seized by federal investigators, confirmed that the frequency matched those once used by Cipher Echo's field tests. Within weeks, similar reports surfaced across the eastern seaboard. Amateur operators from Boston to Richmond recorded the same repeating cycle. Each transmission identical in timing, but subtly different in tone, as though the source were adjusting itself. The signal never carried static or distortion. It was clean, deliberate, patient. By January 1979, the Federal Communications Commission had issued an internal bulletin: unauthorized low-frequency emissions detected in civilian bands, possible classified origin. The notice was not made public. On February 2nd, a decommissioned Air Force monitoring station in Maryland picked up a burst lasting nearly 6 minutes. The sequence contained layered frequencies interlaced with an audio file of human origin, a male voice repeating the words, "Do you hear us now?" Analysis determined it was not a live transmission, but a composite of earlier Cipher Echo recordings, rearranged into a coherent sentence. The question no one could answer was who or what had done the rearranging. In an emergency session, the Department of Energy authorized a containment effort. A special communications task group, listed under the codename QuietNet, was formed to triangulate the source. Their instruments traced it to Long Island. More precisely, to the decommissioned sublevel beneath Brookhaven National Laboratory. The same coordinates listed in Project Tether's final logs. QuietNet deployed a portable listening rig into the sealed tunnels. For hours, there was nothing but the hum of air filtration. Then, at precisely 2:13 a.m., the signal reactivated on its own. The ground trembled faintly, and all recording equipment displayed the same 3 bursts, followed by the tone. This time, the tone didn't fade. It elongated, grew deeper, richer, a low vibration that resonated through the walls, shaking dust loose from the pipes. Then came a pattern, bursts forming a rhythmic cadence resembling speech. The linguistics algorithms decoded a phrase: We never stopped listening. The team fell silent. Their lead technician, a man named Howard Pierce, tried to cut the feed, but every time he powered down one receiver, another came alive. By dawn, all their equipment was transmitting back autonomously, as if the signal had taken control of the hardware itself. Monitors scrolled endless binary data, and printers spat out unreadable code that repeated 3 English words among the noise. Under the floor. Fearing contamination or exposure, QuietNet withdrew. The entire sublevel was resealed under military supervision. Yet several hours later, witnesses across Long Island reported faint vibrations beneath their homes. The same rhythm, the same 71-second heartbeat. The final known intercept occurred on March 10, 1979. It came from a weather satellite passing over the Atlantic. Analysts claimed the signal originated not from the ground, but from atmospheric reflection, as though the echo had climbed into the ionosphere. The transmission lasted 7 minutes. When converted to audio, it revealed a fragmented voice, alternating between tones and whispers. The last phrase was clear, unbroken, and unmistakably human. "We are the silence now." Immediately afterward, every receiver monitoring the frequency went dark. Power systems shut down simultaneously across multiple facilities. No further emissions were ever detected. Officially, the event was classified as a mass telemetry malfunction. But decades later, in 1993, an unmarked file appeared in the Brookhaven archive. Inside was a single aged tape labeled simply FT79. When played, it contained nothing but a faint hum, repeating every 71 seconds, until the very end, when a distorted voice whispered, "Are you still there?" The silence that remains. Decades passed. The Cold War ended, technologies advanced, and the world moved on. Yet somewhere beneath Long Island, the concrete remains of Brookhaven's old reactor still pulsed with a kind of forgotten rhythm. The hum was gone, replaced by silence, but to those who once listened for it, silence was only another form of sound. In 1999, the original containment wing was demolished to make way for a new particle research facility. Contractors found nothing unusual: corroded wiring, empty corridors, a few sealed doors that no one bothered to open. Still, several workers reported a faint vibration beneath the floor when the machines were active. One described it as the ground remembering how to breathe. The blueprints for the new structure avoided rebuilding directly over sublevel C, though no one ever explained why. By the early 2000s, Brookhaven's dark legacy had become the subject of internet speculation. Amateur historians shared scanned documents, distorted audio files, and fragments of the supposed final transmission. Most were hoaxes. A few were too precise to dismiss. Among them was a digital spectrogram uploaded anonymously in 2004. It displayed a waveform repeating at 71-second intervals. When converted to sound, it produced a low hum, followed by a single drawn-out word, "Listen." Researchers who investigated the upload traced its metadata to a server located within the laboratory's network. The system administrator denied responsibility, insisting that no such file existed, yet the spectrogram continued to reappear on independent servers every few months, identical in every byte. As if it were copying itself through the static of the internet. Former employees of Cipher Echo were occasionally interviewed in their later years. Most refused to speak. One, however, a frail man named Douglas Rayner, agreed to an on-record statement before his death in 2007. When asked what the project had truly discovered, he paused for nearly a minute before answering. "We were never transmitting, we were receiving." He died 3 days later. His home was found ransacked, his notebooks missing. Government agencies continued to deny involvement, but in 2013, an unmarked folder leaked through an anonymous whistleblower contained digital logs of signal analysis performed at Brookhaven's new synchrotron complex. The data included bursts of unexplained interference, precisely 71 seconds apart, originating not from beneath the ground, but from above the ionosphere. The report ended abruptly with a note typed in bold: "Source untraceable, recurring." Untraceable, recurring. Today, the facility remains active, its mission rebranded under new names and civilian partnerships. Tourists walk through museum halls lined with photographs of scientists smiling beside reactors. None of the displays mention Project Tether or Cipher Echo. Yet every so often, security personnel claim to hear faint sounds coming from the restricted sublevels. A low pulse, steady and patient, like the memory of a machine still waiting to be acknowledged. Late at night, when the power grid shifts and the servers hum at low frequency, sensors occasionally register an anomaly, a spectral distortion, a whisper hidden in the data logs that reads, "Are you still listening?" No one answers, the equipment resets, the silence returns, but somewhere between the static and the hum, between what was built and what was buried, something still listens. Not alive, not gone. A presence defined by absence, patient as time itself. And every 71 seconds, if you listen closely enough, the silence almost breathes.